Hammer is a journalist and the author of The River, A Journey Through the Murray-Darling Basin. Good morning, Chris.
G'day, Trevor.
Chris, let's firstly define what the Murray-Darling Basin is.
Well, it's all those rivers in eastern Australia, west of the mountains, that flow eventually into the Murray and down into the sea. Not quite right, but it's a huge area. It's about 1 million square kilometres, twice the size of Germany. Pretty much takes in all of New South Wales west of the coastal mountains, pretty much all of Victoria, sort of north or west of the mountains, quite a large lump of southern Queensland, bit of eastern South Australia around where the Murray flows down into the lower lakes and the sea there, and all of the ACT. So big area of land, supports about 2 million people.
When you take a look at that, because it is a significantly large area, but also so many rivers and smaller rivers that join together into one larger one. When you look at it that way, you don't notice it in many other places. It's just a very, very elaborate scheme.
Well, that's right. It's the Australian equivalent, I guess, of the Missouri-Mississippi system. It drains that whole sort of eastern inland side of the continent.
For that reason, we'll go right back firstly and take a look at how significant that region is to Indigenous people, because this is where most of the Indigenous settlements would have been. Yeah,
look, now, I set off to write this book a few years ago now at the height of the drought, and I set off, and what I was mainly looking at to start with was environmental issues, because that was the big issue of the day. That and how irrigators were coping with the drought. But as I travelled around, I started getting into the history, the culture, the importance of the river system and the bush to Australians. And another thing that I sort of stumbled across, got interested in, was the Indigenous history in the Murray-Darling Basin. Like many sort of white urban Australians, don't really know that much about Indigenous history. And I guess like many people, I had this idea that, most Aboriginal groups were nomadic. They were small groups. They were isolated groups. But out along the river system, nothing could be further from the truth, in that these were the major kind of trading routes between different groups and different tribal groups. And the rivers were incredibly important culturally, geographically, as trade routes for food, the whole thing. Just one example, up at Brewarrina in New South Wales, western New South Wales, on the Barwon River, which is a river that basically it's the same river as the Darling River. It becomes Darling a little bit lower down there, but there are these fish traps there that are basically stone rings that sort of concentrate one after another fish into smaller and smaller rings, to the point where you can just sort of bend down and pick them up. These are between 16 and 18,000 years old.
Wow.
They've been in constant use up until a few years ago. Now, to give that a bit of perspective, Stonehenge in England, that great Neolithic monument there, is 4,000 years old. So this is like, between 4 and 5 times years older, and is indeed probably the oldest man-made structure still existing on Earth.
Chris, sorry, go on.
And, there were times, even 100 years ago, where you get 5,000 Aboriginal people gathering there for feasts when they knew the fish were coming. And it's the same down the river system at places like Menindee Lake and Lake Victoria. Massive gatherings of people when they knew the water was there and the fish were there and the mussels were there. And down along the Murray, there's midden heaps, which are the shells that are thrown away once you've eaten the food, kilometres long and metres deep, that, in subsequent years were kind of bulldozed down and used to line roads and used as building material and that. And all this signifies large groups of people coming large distances to gather, to feast, to celebrate, to corroborate, whatever, and all through the sort of Indigenous Dreamtime stories. The rivers are very prominent, often with stories of of the rainbow serpent, carving out the river channels, whatever. So it was a very important part of Indigenous life, and still is in many ways.
It's interesting you said that you started the book wanting to take a look at the environmental issues and the ecological issues. Is that something you have to be open to as an author, that as you take a look at one thing, to be open to other things and let that become part of the story?
Well, in my case, I felt that was. I could understand another author saying, no, look, I'm focusing on this and I'll ignore everything else. But when I travelled out, I'm a Canberra-based journalist, and I'd been writing on these issues and talking to a lot of politicians, and it was all about water licences and gigalitres and water trading and buybacks and all that sort of stuff, which is all highly technical, and I think it was an argument being conducted within a small group. So I wanted to get out, and part of the reason was not to talk to any politicians or fill it up with technical stuff, but to get out and talk to people on the rivers themselves. And of course, when I get out and did that, people had views about all sorts of things, not just irrigation or national parks, etc.
When did we start to see, first of all, it explored and settled?
By Europeans.
By Europeans, yeah.
Well, pretty much as soon as Black Sand, Wentworth and Lawson crossed the Blue Mountains in 1813, if you do that today, you drive across the mountain, you get to Bathurst, well, you're in the Murray-Darling Basin, okay? And from then on, you get a lot of explorers breaking out. You get Hume and Hobble going down to Melbourne, to where Melbourne was subsequently established. But in doing so, they crossed the Murrumbidgee and they crossed the Murray near Albury, so they were discovering rivers. But this really interesting thing happened that I covered in the book. Matthew Flinders, the great Australian navigator, he's the first to circumnavigate Australia. He circumnavigated Tasmania. He named Bass Strait. He popularised the word Australia. But in circumnavigating Australia, when he got into the waters of South Australia at Encounter Bay, he ran into this French explorer, Nicolas Baudin, and the two exchanged pleasantries and whatever. But both of them missed the mouth of the Murray River. Now, I don't know why. It's possible that the Murray wasn't flowing that year, or perhaps they thought it was, if the water was very low, they might have thought it was just a bit of an insignificant sort of coastal estuary. But what that meant is when these explorers went across the mountains and found big rivers like, the Murrumbidgee and the Murray flowing off westwards, they were going, well, hang on, we know they don't reach the sea, because Matthew Flinders would have noted them on his circumnavigation of Australia. So they must go into this big inland sea somewhere. So what you had is these explorers heading off, trying to chase rivers down, not to find their sources, is what has happened in exploration elsewhere. They're trying to find where they ended up, because they thought there would be this wonderful inland sea with lots of water and would be perfect for settlement. And it wasn't until 1830 Charles Sturt followed the Murrumbidgee until it reached the Murray, and then followed the Murray all the way down to the lower lakes inside of the sea, and he dispelled that myth. He was the one who said, no, actually, these rivers do run to the sea. There is no inland sea.
How far did they go? Did they go inland before they thought, no, hang on, we've gone far enough, there's really nothing here?
Well, Sturt himself, so in 1830 he realises that the Murray-Darling rivers reached the sea. Adelaide was established very shortly afterwards, about 1836. He settled there, he took sheep down, but he was still obsessed by this idea of an inland sea. So he started heading up right into the interior of Australia, like right up into the red centre, still believing that this may exist. In the end, he got so sick, he got scurvy, he went temporarily blind, he only just made it back from his last expedition. So this myth hung around for quite a while, But meanwhile, the Murray-Darling, as we know, was starting to be settled.
And so this is right up through Broken Hill and further away.
Yeah, Broken Hill lies just outside the Murray-Darling.
Yep.
But it's only about 100 kilometres west of the Darling River itself, and actually draws its town water from Menindee Lakes on the Darling River.
Guest this morning, Chris Hammer, who is the author of The River, A Journey Through the Murray-Darling Basin. European settlement and farming would have been, of course, so important. When did we start to see irrigation?
Well, irrigation came a little bit later on. The first thing that happened out in the Murray-Darling was wool. This was the big boom industry of Australia in the 19th century. We rode on a sheep's back. So you had these sheep stations pushing way out west, out past places like Burke and wherever. But the big problem was, how did you get the wool to market? Like some of these places are 1,000 kilometres from the coast, and you'd stick it on the back of a bullock dray and take it to Sydney or something was a logistics nightmare. So they started sending wool down the rivers, and Adelaide started getting very rich because it was at the end of the river. And they had, the South Australians actually funded a competition, £4,000 prize money, which is a lot in those days, to see whether these rivers were navigable. And they did. They took steamships right up the Murray, probably almost as far as Albury, and up, or at least as far as Echuca, and right up the Darling to Burke. And so they bring the wool clip out down these barges and behind the old steamboats. And the trouble is the rivers were pretty unreliable. Even the Murray and the Murrumbidgee were likely to start running low in summer, and boats would get stuck. In the Darling, you'd have boats stuck up there for a year or two, waiting for the next flood to rise so they could float the wool clip down. So what wasn't perfect. But then what happened is the railroads started being put through from Melbourne up to Echuca in the 1860s. This is about 1850s, 1860s. So the rail lines between Sydney and Melbourne and Albury up to Burke in the 1880s. Wagga, 1870s, that sort of thing. So once the railway lines started going in, then there was, that was a far more efficient way of getting the wool out. And then you had a bit of a divide there, because the South Australians still wanted to use the river for irrigation, for navigation. They wanted the water kept there so the boats could get up and down, whereas New South Wales and Victoria were starting to get into irrigation. The father of Australian irrigation is Alfred Deakin, who's a Victorian politician, later became a Prime Minister of Australia in the early years. He went off and did a tour in America, went to California, saw some of the irrigation there, met a couple of brothers, the Chaffeys, and invited them out to Victoria to start irrigation there, which they did in Mildura, which was I think it was like 1886 or something like that. And at the same time, they started an irrigation colony, as they called it, in Renmark in South Australia. So they were the first two big irrigation schemes, way out where the land was very flat. And so the water could be diverted from the river and then be kind of gravity-fed through canals, so there wasn't a lot of pumping involved.
Chris, did that cause a political divide at the time between South Australia and the other states as far as water flow is concerned? Or was it questioned?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and that is still, the Murray-Darling Plan, we've just seen enacted this year in Parliament, is in some ways the end result, hopefully a kind of resolution to many of the arguments that started back then. Because what happened is New South Wales was the mother colony, okay? When Victoria was hived off, the Murray River became the border between the two. But unlike elsewhere in the world, where you put a marine border or a river border, you just put the border down the middle of the river. the New South Welshmen said, oh, no, the border will be the high water mark on the Victorian side. So in other words, all the water in the Murray belongs to us. And it wasn't until 1914 that an agreement was reached between Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia on a share of the Murray River water, and the Murray River water alone. And the reason was that in the 1890s, the Murray ran dry, and it ran dry again in 1903. You see these photographs of people driving their buggies out in the middle of the river and having a picnic, on the dry riverbed. And for South Australia, this was catastrophic, and it wasn't much fun for New South Wales or Victoria. So what they did is they had an agreement whereas a certain amount of water, a volume amount of water, would be given to South Australia every year, guaranteed by New South Wales and Victoria, and the rest of the water in the river would be shared equally between New South Wales and Victoria. But to make this happen, they started building massive infrastructure. They stopped the Murray being a natural river because they wanted to stop it from running dry.
Oh, so we're going to make sure they only get that amount exactly.
Yeah, and look, one of the problems, and people, I don't think, understand much about the Murray-Darling Basin Plan because it's quite complicated. But what happened after that 1914 agreement where the water in the Murray was shared, it gave an incentive to New South Wales and Victoria not to let any other water go in. So the second biggest river by volume in the basin is the Murrumbidgee River. And all of that water is New South Wales. But once any of it flows into the Murray, half of it becomes Victoria and some of it becomes South Australia. Same the issue with the Goulburn River in Victoria. So once the water flows into the Murray, half of it goes to New South Wales. So there was this real incentive for the states to use all the water in the tributaries to the Murray and not let any get into the river itself. That, in essence, is what the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is trying to change. So some of the water from the Murrumbidgee and the Goulburn actually flows into the Murray and helps with the health down the river into South Australia. So these arguments have been going probably since the 1830s to now.
And
whether they're resolved now, I don't know.
And at this time, all of the Indigenous people are saying, what are you on about? It belongs to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good morning, Anna.
I heard a story, you know how the paddle steamers had to go down the river and they needed wood and people would have stacks of wood that they would sell, and one man was pinching the wood. He wasn't paying for it, so they set him up with, what did they use, gunpowder or jelly?
Dynamite. Dynamite's the one I heard, yeah.
And they got him one day, so...
Was there a bit of that going on, Chris?
He put the wood in the boiler and then blew the steamboat up. No evidence that this actually happened, but it's actually in the book, that story, because there's great history in the Australian bush of telling bush yarns, these exaggerated stories. So you always hear these stories, particularly up along the Darling. Oh, just down there, 100 kilometres, a bloke took the steamboat out on the floodplain and the flood receded and his boat was stranded 11 miles from the river channel. You hear that story all the time, but the location of where the boat actually was shifts up and down the river. And you kind of come to think, well, it's a kind of a cool story, an exaggeration of the sort of thing that happened quite frequently.
It must be lovely when you write a book to be able to weave the anecdotes in with the ecology and the facts and the rest of it, and being able to weave them together.
Yeah, look, I love doing this book. It's kind of like travel writing, but sometimes travel writing can be interesting. You go somewhere, you talk to people, you recount your adventures, but it's a little bit pointless. Whereas this one, I set out with a purpose of finding, hey, what's really going on out along the rivers. And so I kind of had this lovely license just to talk to people about whatever they wanted to talk about.
Bev, good morning.
Hi, how are you? Listen, I've always been a bit puzzled. During the drought, I'm from Queensland, and during the drought, of course, it was really big talk. I was wondering, when was the barrage built across down at the mouth of the river in South Australia to keep the fresh water sort of banked up? because I couldn't work out why, if it was an estuary, that it was such a talking point or such a distressing thing if they let the salt water come over into that area. But if it's been around for 100 years, well, obviously the whole culture of the place, agriculturally and everything, would have been built around fresh water. So can you tell me when that barrage or whatever it is, it's some sort of a...
Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, it's about the 1920s. It came out of that agreement. What they did was they put the barrages in to protect the lakes. When the river's flowing strongly, the lakes would have been fresh water anyway. When the river wasn't flowing strongly, then the salt water would come in from the sea. And what they did is they had plans to build weirs all the way up to Echuca with locks, and they've pretty much done it up to as far as Mildura on the Victoria-New South Wales border, so 900 kilometres of river. There's a barrage at the end protecting the lakes from the sea, or from the Coorong, which is a marine inlet, and then the sea. And there's all these locks, so you can get in a little, motorcraft. You can come in from the sea through a lock into the lakes, then you go up the Murray to Blanchetown where there's lock 1, you go through another lock, and you do that all the way up to Mildura. So that whole South Australian part of the Murray River is more or less like a canal. It's very highly regulated river. This was a big issue during the drought, because what happened is that there wasn't enough water coming down the river to push the lakes out into the sea. They were starting to dry up and expose soil that would turn poisonous if exposed to air. And also, the lakes were becoming increasingly salty anyway. When the river's flowing, something like 2 million tonnes of salt a year are pushed out of the Murray out into the sea. It's because a large part of the Murray-Darling Basin was once, millions and millions of years ago, was the bed of a shallow sea. So salt, as anyone who lives in any of the irrigation areas or even dry land farmers would know, salt's a huge problem in the basin. But there was that debate whether, because the lakes were becoming exposed to air and becoming increasingly salty, that it might be better just to pull down the barrages and let the salt water in. That would be very damaging, but maybe not as damaging as letting the lakes dry out altogether. And in the end, the rains basically came just in time. There were plans to build $100 million weir across the head of the lakes. There are all sorts of emergency plans being considered down there, which fortunately didn't have to be implemented in the end.
Riley?
I was out at Wilcannia in 1999, and something that I think we should all be aware of. Number one, the Murray-Darling, one of the great river systems on the planet. The other one is I was out at Wilcannia, as I said, in 1999, and I was shocked. The wharf at Wilcannia, it was probably 6 metres to the actual water, and the people I was with at the time, I'm sort of looking down at this big gap between the wharf and where the water was. They said, oh yeah, the water was right up on the wharf, and there was paddle steamers and what have we. And we've just put so much stress on the Murray-Darling with our farming practices over, since the area's been self-settled. And I think it's a great shame.
Riley, I'll go back to Chris in just a second because we'll talk about that the last 5 minutes of the news. Warwick?
Yes. I was going to ask, is there any fish or animal that just stay around the Murray there?
Yeah, Chris, do you want to just quickly answer that first?
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot of native fish and yabbies and all sorts of things in the river system. Most famous of all is the Murray cod. Put under threat mainly by introduced species, the evil European carp. Also stresses on the river from, agricultural chemicals and whatever. But no, there's a whole ecosystem. If you go to somewhere like the Barmah Forest, which is a huge river red gum forest down near Echuca, there are all sorts of bird life and little critters and fish, and there's an amazing environmental assets along the river, up in the mountains, down by the sea. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the earlier caller just talked about the stresses on the river and the effects that it had out of Wilcannia, and I guess all along the Murray-Darling Basin. When you take a look at it, when was it starting to be recognised that the impact of what's happening as far as farming and irrigation is concerned is having a really large effect on the river system?
Well, I think there was a lot of concern for many years in localised areas. Typically, the problems compound. So down in South Australia in the lower lakes, they'd be realising issues earlier on. What really brought it home, though, was that drought that lasted for 10 years. The Howard government tried to do something about it, but FAO couldn't get the states on board, and eventually the Rudd government was able to get the various states to sign up to work towards some sort of agreement. But it was really that drought that focused the minds of politicians, and I think made both the federal government and the state governments realise that a national approach was needed, and essentially that there was a limit to how much you could use for irrigation. What had happened, they built this huge dam, Hume Dam, up near Albury in the 1920s to guarantee the river system, to drought-proof the farmlands. But then demand kept growing, so they put in the Snowy Mountain Scheme, which diverts the Snowy River inland into the Murrumbidgee and the Murray. And then in the 1970s, they built another huge dam called Dartmouth to go guarantor to this river system. Every time, though, it was, as they built more supply, there was more demand for irrigation and to open new irrigation areas and to give out more water licences. I think that's stopped now. I don't think, the government has been buying back water licences so it can have water for the environment. The days of expansion in irrigation areas is over. That doesn't mean that they won't still thrive, that they can't grow more lucrative crops, be more efficient in their farming. But you're really talking the last 10 or 15 years that realisation has really, become apparent.
Chris, had there been groups or people, especially further down the river system, that had been saying this for a long time before that?
Oh, yeah, and particularly with the river red gum forests that are all down the Murray, the Murrumbidgee rivers in particular, that, local areas are getting logged out. There was grazing them, so there's a series of national parks there. And there's still if you go to a local area, you'll get a lot of local arguments, environmentalists wanting to protect pieces of land, traditional farmers who have, say, grazed cows, in forests, or collected wood. And there's arguments over the best way of looking after some of these forests, because the argument is often made before European settlement, Aboriginal Australians would burn the forest every couple of years as part of their land management. So something similar needs to be done now. So these arguments are ongoing, particularly at a local level.
Chris, we're about a minute away from the news. Through your research of the book, what is it that struck you the most?
I just love the people, and how much the people in any given area really love their rivers and love their land. And, at the height of the drought, the resilience there of trying to stick together and see it through. So in the end, although the environment is beautiful and I loved it, the thing I think in the end that really impressed me was the people.
And the other thing within that is we haven't even touched on how important the river is recreationally and socially as well.
Oh, it is the beach for many, many inland communities. It's where you go on the long weekend, you go and camp on the river.
And when it's hot, you go and have a swim.
That's right.
Chris, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
No problem.